America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
And you can subscribe to the show at SalemPodcastNetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we're joined by Scott Rodrick. Scott is the president and CEO of Rodrick Foods. Starting from a single franchise location in San Francisco in 1993, Scott now owns 18 McDonald's restaurants, employing over 800 employees. Plus, he's co-founder of the California Alliance of Family-Owned Businesses, which serves as an advocate for the interests of family-owned business and owner-operators, championing their causes at both the state and local government levels. Scott, welcome to Main Street Matters.
Thank you, Elaine.
I love your story, starting out with one store and growing it. It's kind of the American dream. Tell us a little bit about how you got into the franchisee side of things and how you kind of built that business.
That sounds and seems like forever ago, but I became a franchisee 30 years ago, but in fact, I'm a second generation McDonald's franchisee. My father, Guy Rodrick, was one of Ray Kroc's early pioneering franchisees in South Florida, where I was raised. So in high school, on the weekends and over the summers, I worked in my family's McDonald's franchises. That would have been probably early 80s. And when I graduated from high school and went off to college, I pursued a career in investment banking in New York City. But the entrepreneurial spirit is always boiled in my veins. And I called my father one day and said, I'd like to get into the family business full time. And he looked at me with eyes askew and said, really? You're going to leave your investment banking world, Wall Street, to come work in McDonald's? And I said, yeah, I have ketchup in my veins, just like you did. And so he helped me find a McDonald's opportunity, which so happened to be in the city of San Francisco. I definitely had been to California. I'm not sure that I'd actually been to San Francisco, but it was of the options presented to me as a first-time franchisee. I felt like California, with its sun and great reputation at the time, thought it was a great place to stake my business. And so I opened my first McDonald's and became a franchisee in 1993.
Wow, that's fantastic. And just for our listeners, I think a lot of people don't really understand the franchisee industry, because when they drive by McDonald's, they just see that the golden arches and they see the big company corporate environment. They think it's a big corporate owned store. But in McDonald's case, most of McDonald's stores, from what I've read, are franchisee owned. Is that correct?
Elaine, totally right. I would say about 90% of the McDonald's across the United States are owned by independent, family-owned companies like mine. There are about 2,500 or so franchisees across the 50 states. And so you can imagine it's quite a diverse, big group of entrepreneurs that have essentially explored and built their little mini hamburger empires under the golden arches on the franchising platform, which I'm sure as Main Street has reported on because of your relationship with so many successful, wonderful franchise brands in all kinds of sectors. The franchising platform is an extraordinary way to realize an entrepreneurial dream, to build generational wealth, and to create jobs and provide services, frankly, in communities large and small all across the country. And so, yes, 90% of the McDonald's that you see around the country, whether they be in big cities or small cities, the West Coast, the East Coast, are owned by 2,500 independent different business owners.
Scott, I can't imagine anybody more on the front lines of the economy than you. I would venture to guess that you have a better finger on the pulse of the current economy than 99, maybe every economist in the country. Can you give our listeners a sense of what you're seeing on the ground right now? What are the economic challenges that are really facing small businesses and consumers today?
Well, from my perspective as a California franchisee, I have a little bit more in-depth, stressful, complex view of what's happening in the economy because of the extraordinary and unprecedented legislation that passed effective April 1st relative to raising the minimum wage in the state of California, targeted only to the subsector of fast food franchises, if you can believe it. It's the first time that I can think in U.S. history where a governmental body decided to target unfairly a single subsector of an economy to increase the minimum wage by 25% overnight. So think about that as a small business owner. How do you plan for that on your financials, your forecasting, your balance sheet a year or 2 or 3 years ago when you're thinking about financial planning and business growth? Here you have a governmental body passing a law that overnight, not for the entire state of California, not the idea of a fair wage for one is a fair wage for all, but a subsector that impacts 15,000 franchise restaurants in California being hit over the head with a 25% wage increase. You can imagine my view on the economy and the inflationary pressures that we're dealing with on both sides of my counter are at the forefront of my head. So my view of what's happening in California is a little bit skewed and a little bit negative these days. But as all business owners know, you can't just, quit your job. Your job, your business is your livelihood. And so instead of lamenting this bad legislation that's happened to us in California, I'm taking my time, my resources, my team to focus on ways that I can survive the tumult and perhaps even thrive in the tumult relative to capturing more market share.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Tell us a little bit more about the consequences you're facing and the steps you're having to take, whether that be fewer hours, more automation, or what have you.
Well, so let's take a big step back, and I want to underscore when I shared with you this concept of this ill-timed and poorly conceived legislation in a place like California. It could not have happened at a worse time. As reported this spring, the unemployment rate in California was 5.3% of the population. That is the worst unemployment rate in the entire United States. That's the definition of bad timing. And when you look at, for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they just reported in California, it has the slowest job growth, number 50 of 50 states in the United States. That, again, underscores this concept of just poorly conceived, ill-timed legislation. So now, small business owners, family-owned business owners like myself have to sit and unpack how to now react to the 25% wage increase that happens overnight. And by the way, it's not just wage in terms of the inflationary impact, because if you think about the impact on for example, payroll taxes, workmen's compensation rates, there are a host of negative halo issues when a wage impact that happens like this that go far beyond just the base minimum wage. So to your good question, Jordan, how are businesses dealing with it? I think in the early stages of April, there was a lot of panic in the fast food space, fast food operators talking about closing restaurants and reducing staff, reducing hours. And frankly, at least in my organization, that is the last thing that I was considering, because for the last 30 years in my business, my employees are my greatest asset. So the last thing that I want to do is to negatively impact the lives of my employees, because I'm only successful if they're successful. And so I've had to look at a host of things relative to running my business, not the least of which is trying to grow my business at the expense of my competitors. And when I say competitors, think about the whole dining out experience. Today, people dine out at gas stations. They get food from Costco. They get food at grocery stores, and so folks are definitely dining out less. And those that are dining out are spending less money. So my goal as part of this post-April 1st hurricane that has hit the 15,000 restaurants here in California has been to try to increase my top line, because if I can do that in terms of incremental business at the expense of my competition, then I don't have to worry or focus so much on reducing hours or cutting hours or closing stores. But I still have to make a lot of hard choices. For example, do I defer a several $100,000 dining room remodel? Do I put off replacing a fryer versus just spending a lot of money repairing it, but certainly less money on my balance sheet to replace fryers? So there are a host of things that I have to think about in my business. Here's another one. It's quite interesting. McDonald's has in my restaurants, we've really embarked on a much more aggressive approach to expanding our digital footprint. That means more orders on the delivery channel, more orders on mobile order and pay on people's phones and on the kiosks. And while it doesn't replace labor, because I take that labor that was allocated, let's say, to the front counter and move it to other parts of the restaurant, the philosophy is that if I can make labor more efficient by growing the top line and reallocating labor in my restaurant to other parts of the restaurant that fulfill things like delivery and the mobile order and pay and curbside pickup of food, then I'm not impacting my employees' livelihood. And so I'm trying to look at every possible way to increase my sales and to reduce my costs and still try to provide value to my customer, convenience to my customer, and a livelihood for myself.
I'm curious, you mentioned, and we know that this law targeted franchisees in the state of California, so a subset of small businesses. You said 15,000?
15,000 franchised restaurants.
Is there any litigation currently pending or planned that you're aware of against this law? Because it seems like when the government is unfairly targeting groups like this, it seems that there must be something that we can do from a litigation standpoint.
So I think very early on, when these laws were being discussed about a year ago, and they were in the form of what they called AB Assembly Bill 257 and AB 1228, Assembly Bill 1228, there was some early talk within the business community about ways to litigate against this unfair, ill-timed, discriminatory, targeted legislation. And frankly, after a lot of attorneys for the industry and even individual brands looked at it, it became obvious that the way the law was written allowed the governor and the legislature to execute their plan without any stoppage, interference, revision through legal channels. So in essence, other than trying to flex muscles and trying to go into legislator offices to pitch our case, our defense, there was really nothing we could do about changing the law. And now here we are, April 1st, 2024. It is pretty extraordinary. There are many cities that have been aggressive in increasing the starting wage or the living wage. For example, I have restaurants in the city of San Francisco that were required by mandate to spend more money than even the state of California's $16 an hour wage. And even in a place like San Francisco, that was always a step ahead, very progressive in terms of trying to, level the playing field for the working class in a city like San Francisco. Even a city like San Francisco, in the early days of its own minimum wage increases that were higher than the state, they took a thoughtful step-laddered approach that was guided by this CPI philosophy, so that it wasn't 25% overnight. It was 3 or 4% every single year. And that approach, I think, was fair to the employees, fair to the business owners who could at least plan for labor increases as part of their business planning and their forward forecasting. And when you juxtapose that against what has happened in the state of California, this massive 25% increase overnight targeted to one subsector of our economy, it is pretty unprecedented and extraordinary. And so I think many of us wish that there would have been a legal avenue to challenge the fairness of it all. But unfortunately, in a state of like California, that was to no avail to us.
I recently we work closely with the franchisee association. It's the coalition of franchisee associations, actually, which is the heads of all the different, the head of the Burger King Association, the head of the McDonald's, head of, Sir Speedy and other groups, Dunkin' Donuts. I was recently at one of their meetings in Washington, D.C., and I was talking to some Domino's franchisees. One was in Illinois and one was in Arizona. And we were talking about the $20 an hour wage. It has sent a ripple through the rest of the country for franchisees on the fear that this cancer in California will grow. And they referenced a new Domino's franchisee who just when the law was passed, or just before it was passed, had just bought a Domino's franchise. And they can't change their contract with Domino's corporate. So you're stuck in your contract. The laws can change unexpectedly. You have no retribution, no legal way to change it, but you also can't change. And I'm not trying to make the franchisors the bad guy, but you also can't change your contract. You owe what you owe on your contract. So, I mean, what is the solution there for franchisees in California?
Well, I think, Elaine, that you've mentioned a couple of very interesting concepts, and you used the words ripple effect, and I think that is so important, because my hope is, through the work that I'm doing, including being on Main Street Matters, is to be able to help educate my fellow family-owned business owners and entrepreneurs outside of the state of California to take action, to elevate their voice, to protect their equity, to protect their future cash flows before what happened to us befalls them. In other words, restaurant owners, franchisees, small business owners should look at what has happened in the state of California as a canary in the coal mine. Unfortunately, I'm coming out of that coal mine, choking with the dust of coal in my lungs, and I hope to survive and fly another day. But I hope that the Domino's franchisees and other small business owners around the country who might be operating in a state that is not very pro-business, to take matters into their own hands and represent their family stories, represent their voice, represent the importance of small business to the economy. I mean, while I've been on this journey defending my small business, of course, I would rather be selling hamburgers and French fries and focus on training my people and my family's been in this business for 50 years. And I frankly would rather be just focused on running a more efficient drive-through and building my delivery business. But here I am having to defend my equity, defend my cash flow, try to protect the jobs that I've created. And now on Main Street Matters, trying to enlighten franchisees and business owners across the country that this might happen in a community near you. If you think about the importance of small business, I mean, I'm sure you've stated the statistics probably on dozens of podcasts. 2/3 of new jobs are created by small businesses like mine. In California, the jobs created by small businesses account for 50% of all private sector jobs. And so when you think about the unemployment rate in California and the slow job growth rate in California, the timing of all of this could not have been more awful. And so if it happened against the backdrop of that timing in California, what's going to happen next in New York or Minneapolis or other states that really don't value the critical importance that small business plays in communities, whether they be in big cities or small rural towns? We are everywhere, and we are critical to the economies in every state, and of course aggregated across the United States. And we need to raise our voice. We need to engage legislators so that they can understand how important we really are before it's too late.
On top of these crazy labor costs that you're facing because of these misinformed mandates, you're also having this stubborn inflation that just goes on and on. can you speak a little bit to the consequences of the inflation that you're feeling, both as a small business with your input costs, but then also your consumers, and if they're pulling back at all? The McDonald's CEO made headlines a couple of months ago in the earnings call highlighting how there perhaps is some attrition in the McDonald's customer that is showing that there's only so much that a consumer is willing to pay for a meal before they decide to just eat at home.
You're right, Jordan. And specifically in my fast food restaurant business, my customers' appetite for unlimited price increases is finite. I just cannot keep on. I can't sell a Big Mac for $25. I can't sell a Happy Meal for $20. So I have to be thoughtful about my pricing approach. The inflation story has multiple sides to it. So of course you read about, you hear about this extraordinary inflationary impact that's happening at the gas pumps, in grocery stores, in restaurants. Every aspect of our life is dealing with a price increase. From my side of the counter, facing the customer, we are dealing with, of course, the most extraordinary, unprecedented wage increase in California history, maybe even in American history on a subsector in the economy. But over the course of the last 5 years, my backdoor food and paper costs have gone up something on the order of 35% versus where we were pre-COVID. Insurance rates, if you can get insurance, have skyrocketed. Workman's compensation, employee liability, general liability, skyrocketed. And think about what's happened with interest rates, where a entrepreneur, a small business owner, a franchisee who might have executed a loan at 3 or 4% variable rate, acquiring their business or growing their business, now faced with 8, 8.5, 9, 9.5%, depending on the terms of the paper. So the access to capital and the cost of capital is also driving, on top of labor, on top of the cost of goods, on top of inflationary costs. It's driving insane costs of doing business. And it doesn't matter whether it's under the arches, like in my business, or whether you run a copy shop or a pet store or a bookstore. Everyone's cost of doing business is higher. And so an entrepreneur, a small business owner with 1 employee or 1,000 employees, has to make the decision: do I raise prices to stay open and to execute the consistent quality services that I offer my community, or do I do nothing? Because not doing anything is not part of anybody's business plan when you get into business. You can't close your eyes and think magically it's going to go away and get better. And so this issue of inflation is extraordinary. It does not feel to me like it's going away anytime soon. And the best we can do is hope for providing some level of sanity and stabilization relative to pricing and guest experience. And that, from my perspective, is my role in this conversation around inflation.
Right. My last question for you, Scott, is more of a philosophical one. My first job was at a Little Caesars, and the skills I learned there were really, it's hard to put into words how valuable the skills that I learned, the soft skills. I was a teenager. I learned sense of urgency, customer service, working with a team of diverse backgrounds. The skills I learned, I still use today, decades later in my career. And I would say over 1 million people work in these jobs right now, but I would venture to say tens of millions of Americans have had that as a first job and as a training ground. Can you speak to just how important it is for the broader economy and society to protect these entry-level starter jobs?
Jordan, your story brings a smile to my face. I love hearing that. And as a matter of fact, someone shared with me the extraordinary statistic that 1 out of every 8 Americans have worked at McDonald's. That kind of blows me away. I can't even believe the volumetrics of that statistic. But it's pretty extraordinary. And I have people that have worked for me in my McDonald's restaurants for 10, 15, 20 years. Every single one of my general managers started as an entry-level minimum wage employee. I think something like a half or 2/3 of all McDonald's owners started as crew people, entry-level hourly employees, and certainly a majority of McDonald's franchisees are people of color, of great diversity. So talk about an extraordinary path to financial security and having a life of your own and creating prosperity and providing services to the communities that you do business in. The whole concept of being a responsible employer to, again, listen, if you want to work for me for 1 month or 1 year and earn a paycheck, and you move on to do something else, that is absolutely fantastic. And if you want to stay with me in my restaurants and you want to learn, as you did, about working on understanding customer service and working within a team and earning a good paycheck and a fair wage, I think that's also a fantastic part of the small business story. The countless number of jobs and opportunities that we provide people like you that went on to do amazing things, now being a broadcaster. But you got your start somewhere, and as you said, you still today use some of the skills that you learned early on in your life in the Little Caesars. And I think that story probably has been told countless millions of times, and it's up to us to share that story, because then it drives more opportunity for folks looking for an opportunity.
I worked in a pizza restaurant also, although it was just a locally owned pizza joint.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that.
Jordan and I have something in common.
Yeah.
I bus tables. Tell us about the California Alliance of Family-Owned Businesses.
I co-founded the California Alliance of Family-Owned Businesses. We affectionately internally call it K-FOB because it's less of a mouthful, with about 125 other McDonald's franchisees in the state of California. And we created that political alliance to raise money and to better educate the California legislator as to what impact their decisions, their voice, their choices have on our livelihoods. And not only the livelihood of restaurant owners in California, but are thousands of employees that their legislation might impact, either in a good way or a bad way. So K-FOB is really focused about elevating collectively the voice of small business, family-owned entrepreneurs, and doing whatever we can to protect whatever remaining equity we have operating in a place like California, and to protect and defend against further cash flow erosion. Because if we cannot tell our story effectively, and we cannot identify legislators that make decisions that impact our lives, I learned this phrase, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that phrase is not any more apropos than what we've just gone through in the state of California.
I love that.
I love that too. Absolutely. Where can people find out about K-FOB, as you call it?
I think you just Google CAFOB.org, and I'm sure we pop up with a big smiling face to tell our countless stories of entrepreneurship and families that are into the second and third generation of being on the franchise platform in the McDonald's world.
Well, I mean, hats off to you. It's such a fight to be out in California. I understand why you're out there. It is a beautiful state. Unfortunately, there's some policies that just make it so difficult for small business owners. So thank you for fighting like you're doing and speaking out, because if small business owners don't speak out, people just are not going to understand the impact. I mean, just the negative impact and consequences to the backbone of this country. So thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you as well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters and tell your story today. And thank you all for taking the time to listen in. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. And we'll be back soon with another episode.